The purpose of this is a great example of a starter activity to engage learners in looking at certain challenge topics, particularly ones about disease and health in stage 9, particularly appropriate for these days, or perhaps it could be about belief systems in stage 8, or maybe even stage 7 and traditions about culture and identity as well. So there's multiple ways that we could use a really quick activity like this in multiple year groups as well. And the point of this task is that it's really engaging. You might have learned something new. You might have been thinking, how did they come to these conclusions? You might have been thinking, I want to know more about this. And this is what we want to encourage in our learners, this engagement, this inspiration, and wanting to learn more. So let's look at how the brain processes it and why global perspectives is so awesome for our brains. So when I asked you the first question about headaches in the ancient Greeks, several things were taking place in your brain when you were trying to decide on an answer. You would have been searching your brain for connections, and you might that you might have had, or understandings that you might know, or you might have been using the picture to inform your choice. I do sincerely hope that none of you have actually had any of these cures and directly experienced them. So, you know, it's prior knowledge, and this is a really, really great tool because your brain processes it faster with the more prior knowledge you have. So the more you know, the more likely you're able to get the answer correct. So the advantage for some of you and for some of our learners in the classroom is that they have more prior knowledge than others. So it makes their selection of the answer easier. So the opposite is also true. If you have no knowledge about the ancient Greeks, you will most likely have relied on a guess to select your answer. And the problem is, instead of having your knowledge confirmed and supported, in the case where prior knowledge is already there, what you've learned is actually just an isolated fact. And without connection to more knowledge, it will easily be forgotten. It's this gap that we have, and that's where our role as a teacher comes in. How do we progress them? How do we bridge this learning gap? More importantly, how will you know if they've actually learned something? So if you access the Learner's Book for Lower Secondary GP, provided by Cambridge University Press, you'll see that prior knowledge is actually one of the first activities that begins all of the skills sections. Discussing this knowledge begins to make new connections for all of our learners. So this is a really important part of global perspectives and in teaching in general, actually. So here's an opportunity for you to get onto the chat and let me know what you're thinking about talking in the classroom. So do you think it has benefits, or do you think it has barriers? I'd like to hear your perspective. And as you're writing on chat, I'm going to talk to you about some of the ideas that talking gives me. So I know that in my classroom, given any opportunity, students love to talk. It has a very important role to play, very important role in the Global Perspectives classroom, incredibly so. But how do we know what someone's perspective is unless we talk but also listen? So there's ideas about talking that also involves it as a two-way process, one where we get to say what we think, but one where we're also receiving information as well. So what do you think on the chat? What's coming through? I'd like to know your thoughts.
We are getting benefits. Other people say both. Some people are saying that it's up to the teacher to guide the conversation. Shy or introverted students to share info, so that it'd be much more satisfying, they say, if they talk.
Yeah, it is really difficult to get shy students, quiet students talking, but there's always ways. Even if you have a little quiz like we started it, it's an interesting way to get them thinking and perhaps get them talking as well. It takes time. So talk in general is one of the most effective teaching tools that we have. It can help us as teachers establish knowledge and strengths, but also the areas that we need to work on. And your students are also learning how to talk, how to listen, how to emphasize, how to mediate between answers. So what about the teacher? Let's come back to the teacher. Well, sometimes it will be your turn to talk, and teaching from the front is a very powerful tool. But there's also power in listening to how your learners talk to each other as well. So how we provide these opportunities are coming up in the next slide. So we're going to have a look at questions that create curiosity. So have a look at this picture on the right-hand side. I would like you to use the chat box to answer my question. What is this object? What is this object? You can tell a few things, so you might be relying on your prior knowledge. It is a black and white photo.
We have to make pasta. Some people say it looks like a loom. It's something ancient.
It looks like a loom?
Yeah, it's something ancient. Something to make cigarettes, a printer, and let's see, somebody else says something to make pasta maybe. It is used to make pasta, and other ones come in. See, can people please make sure that they write to all panelists and attendees so you can all share what you're looking. Somebody else is writing, it looks like a printer, or you can use it to cook. So we're still on the cooking side at the moment, quite a lot.
Oh, fantastic. This is amazing.
Let's see, someone says to make pasta, spaghetti alla chitarra. So
we are in Italy, you know.
Yeah, we're in Italy, so obviously. But
of course. Actually, we're not quite there yet, but do you want to know what the answer is, people? Has it sparked your curiosity? Because the answer is none of those things just now. So do you want to know what the answer is?
Yes.
Yes.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
They're very much stuck.
Yeah, so let's look at what this activity does. Most people, if we put this into the classroom, sometimes our teenagers, they go, I don't know, and we just move on. But actually, I need to change my question a little bit to engage you to find out what the object is and what it might be used for. So actually, I should have planned my questions better. I should have asked, how might this object be used? And then you'll start to notice little details about the object, and it will also tap into your prior knowledge. It does look like a pasta making machine, and I will say you are correct. It does make something. It doesn't make pasta though. It actually makes pills, tiny little tablets. So you put the powder in, you put the ladle on top of it, and you push it backwards and forwards until they roll into tiny balls and drop into that tray on the left-hand side. So there you go. Questions create curiosities. So one of the things that I want you to take away from this session today is how seriously do you plan your questions in advance? Because questions do need to be planned really carefully. Effective teaching in global perspectives really involves asking questions that are the right type of questions. These are questions that need to probe for depth and understanding from the students. But similarly, we also need to plan our questions to make sure our students understand what we want of them, especially when we're giving instructions. So we have CCQs, concept check questions. They're really useful to see if everyone understands what the instruction is. So I'll give you the protocol for it, how to do it in your classroom if you're not already using it. You give the students an instruction, but then you ask them 3 questions. So the easiest way is to make them say a yes or no answer in response to your question. I'll give you an example. Class, I want you to write me a paragraph about this object. Question number 1, are we writing about this object? Hopefully you're all going, yes. Question number 2, are we going to write a story? No. Aha, they understand what they're writing and what they're writing about. So question number 3 is, do we want to write just a paragraph? And hopefully you'll say yes. Questions need time for the students to process the language and form an appropriate response. So having a concept check question helps them understand what's required of them and process that information in a meaningful chunk. It also avoids the answers of, I don't know. And we don't like that response. I hate it. It's the most frustrating thing ever. So when we get into our lesson and we know they've understood the instruction, we need to probe deeply. We need to ask questions that sound like this. Is there a different way to say this? Or can you think of another perspective? Or can you explain to me where you got your answer? Or is this true for everyone or just some people? How does this answer compare to that answer? Lots of questions that probe for understanding and getting them to think in more detail. What this does, it's a form of differentiation, and the main idea is that you're checking for what they've understood rather than if they have understood. So while we're talking about questions, because they are the central point of global perspectives, let's look at Hinge questions. Hinge questions are really, really useful for formative assessment. They're diagnostic questions. They help you understand whether your learners are ready to move on to the next point or whether you might need to stop and recap or reteach a particular idea or bit of content. So it's a really powerful question type actually, because you can get information from your learners very quickly without necessarily interrupting the lesson flow. And it will give you feedback as to whether they've understood that concept or if they've misunderstood, in which case you would have to clear up that misunderstanding before you move on. Otherwise, the prior knowledge that we've been talking about, it can't be built upon and we'll forget it. That's why Hinge questions are super important. Best part about it, there's no marking with Hinge questions and it's instant feedback as well. So there's been a global pandemic. We've been locked down. Some of us still are, some of us aren't. What about language? What's happening with language? On chat, can you just tell me whether you think that the language of your learners in your classrooms are getting better or getting worse during lockdown or during the pandemic in the last year? I'd really be interested in your answer. Because I know for my students, because I have bilingual students here in Cambridge, it got worse.
They're all saying the same, yes. It's getting worse, depending on students, but most of the people are saying it's getting worse. Fluency is getting worse. Yeah, so most of the answers are, like you're saying, it's getting worse, unfortunately. So, yes.
Yeah, it is. And this is, let me just walk you through what the brain is doing when it comes to language, because this is my area of speciality in my research. So levels of language, they get really affected by stress and by anxiety and also by boredom, which means pretty much for the last year, while we've been in lockdown and continued social restrictions, it is going to have a negative impact on language, and that impacts on learning. So in a home learning environment, if your students have spent a long time at home learning, perhaps only where Italian was spoken, there will be very little opportunity for students to practice speaking and interacting in any other language, or if they are, to apply a context such as being in school and learning through global perspectives, perhaps. And what happens is it actually results in a little bit of language regression, and sometimes we'll get behavioural problems alongside of it. They won't want to speak in English, they won't want to engage in lessons. I'm sure you've had this response as well. So I think these are really extraordinary times, and we need to rethink about what we need to achieve out of every lesson, particularly with students who have experienced lockdown in a much different way to us. They're very young, they're very not understanding what's really happening in the world. So perhaps we need to focus a little bit more in our lessons on supporting their social and emotional well-being, instead of this idea of making them use language, okay? So how do we do this? It's a tough one. Language is a social process, and it really needs to be maintained so that you can continue to develop. But this also involves your memory as well. Your memory obviously stores information, and mostly it stores it temporarily in short-term memory, the front of the brain. So again, environmental factors, stress, anxiety, boredom, it all impacts on how much your short-term memory can actually process. But the biggest issue is probably about maintaining attention, because if you can't get attention, you can't have any learning. So one of the great supporting tools that you can have in your classroom is the Learner's Book, because that offers you some very short, stimulating, active things that you can get happening in your classroom to get them to talk and get them to share and get them to just be happy with being together again, which supports social and emotional well-being as well as language learning. Also, tasks that are chunked together, so chunked into meaningful pieces, and they've got good connections where the students are highly engaged and they're really interested. That really allows for that build-up of knowledge and the brain to relax and start to let the memory be processed and learning to take place. So let's look at a way to help language learning as well as focus on global perspective skills. Okay, you might remember the questions on the left-hand side from when you were at school. So we were always taught when we're doing any research, we need to answer what, who, when, where, why, maybe how as well. I really like this, but nobody ever taught me what those words meant and what does it mean to look at a what. So I've developed it for you a little bit. And this is something that you can bring into your classroom, your Global Perspectives classroom, because it actually functions all through the stages. From stage 7 to stage 9, the 5 W's come up in multiple areas, multiple skills. So they're really useful when you're looking at skills like research, analysis, evaluation. And students can also use their knowledge of these 5 W's to reflect on the resources and the materials that they come across. And eventually they'll be able to collaborate with others in order to share these ideas. I love this. It's so simple. And one thing that it does do is introduce being critical about the resources that they come across. It's so important for them to not just accept everything they read, or even worse, go straight to Wikipedia in order to research something. Drives me mad. So how do we put this in? Well, let's look at how we get your plan happening in the classroom. Planning is like hanging out your washing. I hope you do hang out your washing. Otherwise, my metaphor isn't going to work. But I find it very useful to think about this comparison when I'm planning my lessons. It's pretty useful as an analogy. Hanging out the washing on the washing line, it's progressive. It builds from nothing into something. The clothes are like the content that we teach. They're not always the same shape, the same size, or the same order, but they're linked by the skill, which is what the content is attached to. I feel so clever about this. Oh, right. Without this skill, the content can't be linked. Without the content, the skill is empty. So hanging out the washing is also about personal preference, just like planning. We all have our own way of doing it. But on the next slide, I'm going to show you a model of how you might approach the planning and show you how it progresses a class of students in a particular skill. Okay, let's have a look. So, research. This model is based directly on the worked examples of lessons that you can find in the teacher's book for Global Perspectives. I think this came from level 8. So you'll remember that each challenge is based on approximately 6 hours of teaching time. There might be more, there might be less. It depends on whether you think your students are ready to move on. But based on this, we're looking at how to introduce and develop the skill of research over 6 lessons. So you can see it progresses down the left-hand side from understanding and basic competence in what the idea of research is, and it gets stronger, leaving plenty of room for assessment for learning and observing where the students are. You can see by the end, by lesson 5 and lesson 6, they're starting to design questionnaires, very high order thinking. They're looking at applying all these ideas about what they know that good research is into creating something of themselves. It's something that's scaffolded through Bloom's taxonomy and a way of showing progression over the challenge. How you teach that content is completely up to you. I'm just showing you an example of how I would plan for research in a stage 8 classroom. So we have plenty of feedback on the right-hand side as well. Oral feedback from the teacher, how are they getting on? Do they understand what research is? All the way through to peer assessment and perhaps self-assessment with the teacher giving some written feedback about how they've gone and how their reflection is taking shape. So I hope that might be useful to you. I'm pretty sure you're all pretty competent with planning your own lessons, but it's always good to have a second opinion. So let's look at feedback, and I'm going to get you to do some more writing for me. Right. Formative feedback can really drive success in Global Perspectives. Most importantly, this feedback does not always have to be given by you as the teacher. We're busy, we're tired, we've got a lot of things to do. So let's think about formative assessment that gets the students engaged with their own work. Feedback can be self-assessment, perhaps in the form of editing the written work, that's reflection, Or it can be peer assessment using simple protocols like to name 2 things that your partner has done well and 1 thing that can improve. Or it could be feedback that's given by you verbally or written down. So feedback can also be a collaborative discussion as a whole group or a whole class as well. We need to think of bigger and better ways to engage with feedback and not just have it as a piece of paper coming across our desk that we need to mark. So those classroom protocols need to be in place. What are we going to use and when are we going to use it? So changing the way we think about giving feedback is quite hard because teachers really feel like we have to assess everything and be in control. But sometimes we don't give enough thought as to why we need to assess it or what relevance it has to the learner. So if you're thinking about giving feedback, perhaps pause and ask yourself 2 questions. How will this feedback change what my learner is doing? And second question, does it have to be the teacher that gives the feedback? Good questions to keep in mind. Self and peer assessment is also a really, really useful tool. It can be a problem though if clear protocols about respect and constructive feedback are not established first. This was one of the problems that we often come across in training sessions, that those protocols are not quite there and students can be quite mean to each other, teenagers being teenagers. So directing students to be very clear and specific and give them ideas about things they might comment on will help avoid any unhelpful or perhaps mean comments. Similarly, a strategy that I use when I need my students to explain themselves better in writing or in speaking, I use a very, very simple strategy. Because, but, so, and they're questions. It helps them to add on to their thoughts by thinking through what their actual thought is, and it links to higher order ideas like analysis, thinking through alternatives, and also consequences. We're going to model this. Okay, so get ready on the chat. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to make a statement, and you are going to type into the chat box your answer. Hopefully, Marco's going to give me a really good one to respond to, and I'm going to employ my strategy. So, my question is, children up to 16 years of age should not be able to use a mobile phone without their parents' supervision. What's your response? Children up to 16 years of age should not be able to use a phone without parental supervision. So let me know in the chat box. What
right, we already got the first 4 are I agree, I totally agree. Then we have I agree, I totally agree with you. So everyone is agreeing with you, Fleur. Although we have, they shouldn't be allowed to use it without the supervision of the parents. I do not agree, says Alexandra. And then we have, I agree with you. So far, I think nowadays it's just impossible to cheat this. Another point is with limitations. Another, I do not agree. So that's what we have so far.
Right. So for everybody that wrote, I agree, because you haven't told me why. Because? So finish your answer. I need more detail, people. Why should they not be able to?
I'm a mum. There's the first answer you get. And then...
So?
The others are still thinking, why? Oh, because you want to understand the dangerous things that could happen.
So?
Because they might watch bad content, because they might get into trouble.
So?
We know the internet's got dangers. Someone said, I was 15. It's risky if you don't take precautions.
But?
Right.
This
Right.
is, I love this game.
Bad influence from teenagers themselves.
So,
They need to learn how to use the technology, in my opinion. We live in a digital world. We need to teach them to filter the information, is what Alexandra says.
because,
Then we have, you should tell them beforehand about the risks.
but,
I think there's no but. There's an answer from Filippo. And then we have, but at the same time, maybe they should try to become more mature with their mistakes.
right. So this is really good feedback. This is fun, and it's annoying for you, I'm sure, because I'm just not giving you any answers. I'm just saying because, so, but this is so important as a strategy. Each time you've rewritten your thought, you've had to consider adding detail, thinking about consequences, making it wider than just a quick statement. It takes no time for me to create a strategy like this because, but, so, and actually you did all the hard work. I was relaxing with my thoughts here in Cambridge, just saying because, but, so. I provided the questions. You did all the hard work. So if we use that as a group strategy, you can see how much more your students are going to engage, and they're going to really want to fight their corner because they can't judge whether you are agreeing with them or disagreeing with them. So they look to support their answer with more detail, and that's what we want. It's also, because I really like Socrates, it's also an example of Socratic questioning. With everybody engaging with this task, asking questions about questions is a Socratic style of learning. Statements are examined, we get deeper understandings or perhaps alternative understandings. It can sometimes develop into an argument, but we want to stop before it gets that far. So again, the idea is that in that particular strategy, very simple to introduce, you did all the hard work and I did hardly anything. So keep that one in mind. It's super useful and it's very, very, very effective. And it works for speaking as well as writing. Okay, let's look at where you can get some help. So global perspectives, if you're like, oh, I don't have time to plan, I don't know what to do, I'm new to this, right. There are books available. The teacher's book is really useful as a starting point. But we also have learner's skills book, which goes into the classrooms for students to learn from as well. I'm going to talk mainly about the teacher's book because I think it's really, really good as a resource, particularly if you're starting out with global perspectives. It's got a really, really large collection of collaborative and independent activities. And the idea is that it engages you so you can engage your students. What it does is make that learning visible in the classroom. It gives you ideas on formative feedback, self-assessment, peer assessment, group assessment, to get the students to see how far they've come in their learning and also judge their own progression. It's got a lot of probing questions, things that pick up on that prior knowledge, and it's broken down into the 6 sections. So if you have perhaps difficulty with one of the skills, maybe it's something like analysis, this is a really good thing to have in your teacher toolkit to help you plan for those analysis skills lessons. It does actually have sections in it as well that allow you to go through this idea of starting out right through to developing and getting better at. So if you do, or if you are new to global perspectives or feel like you would need some more support, please do try and get hold of one of these books. There's very clear learning goals. There are pretty awesome ideas in the book as well. So with that in mind, my question is, what are you going to do now? Are there any questions? I'm just going to stop sharing and come back to you face to face. Are there any questions?
If there are any, I saw that someone put a hand up. If you've got any questions, do carry on writing them in the chat box, please.
So I'm just going to have, I'm just going to have a look at the chat box because I can see here. I really do like the phones debate though. I totally agree as well, by the way. So let's have a look. Are there any questions? I don't think there are.
I can't see any.
Okay, so would it also be useful for very young learners like 3 to 4 years old? What a great question. So it depends upon their level of understanding. Very young learners, 3 and 4, they mostly are about emotions and how they feel, what they can see and how they can describe. So you can actually get that activated with very young learners, but in a slightly different way than you would for primary or lower secondary students. So I hope that helps you in that answer. I could talk about that all day, by the way, but I do hope that one answer it helps you. Okay, let's have a look. Any information about collaboration between schools? Unfortunately, that's not up to me. I'm a great fan of social media, but that might be a way forward for you if you have access to it, connecting with other teachers as well. Often social media is the place to go for that sort of thing. I'm really pleased to read that people are going to be using some of the tips. So please do. I'm all about working smarter, not harder. That is for sure. So are there any final questions? I don't think so. Right, Marco, should I hand over to you then?
And probably a hand over to Paula because she will probably close it out. There's always the last questions coming in now. But have we got a moment to answer that, Paula, do you think? Or
Yes, it's fine.
Do you mind, Fleur, just picking that up at the bottom there? Because that's a good question.
Do I think that learning languages at home during this period is bad for their memory in the long term? Teenagers' memories are plastic. They're moldable. They work so well. They will recover. It will take time. So it will probably take another year or so for them to recover things that they've lost. However, if we look after the social and emotional well-being, it will recover more quickly. So that is my lesson for you. It's more likely to affect adults long term. Yeah. So, yeah. Right. Paula, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fleur. Thank you very much, Mark. I think that's it. I mean, okay, thank you. Thank you to everybody and see you tomorrow for some other sessions. Have a great evening. Bye. Bye-bye.